All right. So I'll start with a couple of overarching comments that I think is useful. The first is that people need to envision interactions between flows more. And so, for instance, there's a couple of major double turns that exist within the negative strategy that you could easily pick up on. In one instance, they say that we should use historical materialism as an alternative, and in the other instance, they say that we should forget. Right, to have a historical materialism that necessarily is an active form of remembering is at odds with the other alternative, and that means if you solve one, you could leverage it against the other. At the same time, a lot of their links are coming from the fact that the 1AC is an embodiment of Christ, an embracement of that of that narrative, and then their case debate is you're the opposite of that, right? So at some point you could concede we're not Christ. That means that we solve back all your link arguments that are based upon Christ, right? Because they've double turned it, and so you can utilize one piece of offense in order to be able to capture the other. When you kick out of flows, you need to kick out of them better, because their permutations are not just like, well, we could do them together, test the compton, go away. They're also explaining how they solve, which means that when you kick out a queer, the 2AR could go to the queer criticism, solve for that, because that's what the 1AR's analysis is, independent of the permutation. So you're not going for a shifting advocacy or anything like that. You're going for, right, we solve this. And the 2NC did a bunch of work about how heteronormativity and queerness is at the root of all the forms of violence and stuff like that, right? So that means you solve that, and then you could leverage that against their capitalism stuff. And since then you've agreed with impacts that he doesn't explain why aren't true, means that it's an easy way for you to win in that 2AR. And so in order to kick out, you need to then go to the capitalism evidence and explain why those impacts supersede the queer impacts, and use your partner's 1R analysis to essentially debate against that 2NC, because the 1AR doesn't give you anything like, no impact to queerness or anything like that, right? So you don't have an easy impact takeout. And so when you just per makes it go away, well, if it still solves, it still comes first. So then you have to sequence why capitalism is more important very explicitly. Otherwise, the 2AR could do the work in reverse, and then you're in a lot of trouble.
I try to do that a little bit because I said the root cause of all things is fear, which is why we solve for the queer theory.
Right, but then you also then immediately say, but we're not going for that. Yeah, it's like your follow-up sentence, right? So you tell me, and I'm not even going for this turn that I have here, right? But it's just an example of how fear is now the root cause of these other things. But then you're like, okay, and then on cap, and now you're debating cap opposed to your 2AR could have almost not gone to the cap flow at all and just taken the impact cards from the 2NC and explained them in important. And I bet you somewhere in there it's talking about the way that capitalism is structured based upon heteronormativity and stuff like that, because some of their cards just get into listing a bunch of isms that it solves for, and probably capitalism or class oppression is probably laundry listed in one of those pieces, and then it's an easy way to sort of sequence that situation, right? And so that, to kick out more cleanly, you need to do that. Also, I think it's confusing when you have two rolls of the ballot, right? Because then at that point, when there's two rolls of the ballot, you could then pick one. And so the 1AR has the ability to pick one of their rolls of the ballot. And I do sort of like the 1AR's analysis, we have one, so, you should prefer this one versus, the others. But I think that it makes it easier to execute something like a double turns when they give you two competing rolls of the ballot. And so what I would say on the negative side is better to construct a roll of the ballot that sort of all your criticisms gain access to. So regardless of which one you go for, there's a consistent way to view the round.
Well, sorry, because I'm not very good at this. What would what would a roll of ballot?
What could be a roll of the ballot is that who best challenge? Dominant power structures, right? And then if you go for queerness, then that's the dominant power structure. If you go for capitalism, that's the dominant power structure, right? And it's fair because if they win that this root of fear is the dominant power structure, then they have access to be able to compete in your frameworking of the ballot, right? And so one of the things that I think is good in roll of the ballot conversations or debates is not just we do this, they don't do this, but explaining how that role is a fair role for where they could be able to make these arguments and gain access to it. So your role subsumes theirs, because then they could talk about, Christ and breaking down a mentality of fear, because that's within the role of the ballot dominant power structures. But when you talk about just fear, then dominant power structures isn't going to be able to be talked about in its entirety. So your roll of the ballot subsumes theirs. And so you could do this, and this is sort of what you're doing on the app side with your roll of the ballot, is that fear, the root cause question, is what will be able to subsume their roll of the ballot. And I think it can be done a little bit more explicitly, but that, sort of how they can operate, how they turn, that sort of stuff, I think is beneficial. All right. So those things being said, I end up voting negative in a large part because of a case argument that I don't see a very explicit answer to in the 2AR, but even in the 1AR 2AC, the answer is not really responsive to what they're saying, and that's presenting the narrative within a debate round makes them have to argue against Christ, which will mobilize people against the image of Christ, which means that all of your analysis is based upon how you could solve their criticisms is based upon you also being able to essentially solve your aff or be that positive affirmation of life. And if your presentation of the narrative within debate causes people to become adversarial to it, then it can't promote that affirmation of life, which means that all of your link turns to their criticisms, it's harder for you to gain access to. And in the earlier portions of debate, your only answer is to, we're not forcing it upon anyone. People don't have to, adopt Christ. Yeah. But that doesn't answer the argument that they have to debate against Christ, right? So it's not that you have to, they don't have to embrace Christ. In fact, they're saying you're forcing them not to embrace Christ. The opposite of what you're saying.
I thought I answered that in the 2AR, there's the arguments that they brought into the debate, saying that fear is good. Those types of arguments would resolve that.
That they're forced to say fear is good, right?
No, I'm saying those are arguments that they can make. Fear is good. They have two off-case positions that.
Right, but then forcing them to say something like fear is good forces them to argue against the affirmation of life. Right, which means that your project causes people to align themselves against life because you force them to do things like say the opposite of affirming life, affirming the narrative of Christ, because they have to debate against you. So instead of promoting the message, you actually get people to move against the image. Right, and so that's sort of how I think you could get that double turn I was mentioning earlier, because they've said that you actually stop the message of Christ. Okay. So if all the arguments is the message of Christ bad, well then they've said that you stop it, right? Obviously that's at odds with your affirmative, so it's it's high risk, high reward type strategy doing that. But your affirmative, essentially, I'm voting on the fact that it doesn't produce the things you're saying because it mobilizes more people against it. And so your option to respond against for that is I think you could explain how that it is not about what other people are going to do in relation, even if they mobilize against Christ. That is independent, and that as a judge, some of the stuff you were saying in cross-examination in the 1AC is that I'm voting for what I think is a better political strategy. So I could say that it's a better political strategy to promote the narrative of Christ. Doesn't necessarily mean in a debate round, but this is a better strategy in its entirety. But their argument is that in a debate round it's bad, which means that you can't. Your performance doesn't get you the things that you want to be able to get at.
So we should frame it more about your ballot rather than their act of having to negate it.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. My ballot, right? Because that's essentially what a roll of ballot is. What is the judge? What does the judge do in this relationship to it? If I vote affirmative, my ballot affirms life. What they do is not the question, but allows me to then be able to engage access and be able to do that. Right? That's what essentially a roll of the ballot is.
So. A better way to go about it would just be it's not about whether we actually go about solving those things. It's just about whether it's a good idea.
Right, but you can also say that you solve it by essentially giving the flip examples of what you do. Be you don't have to say Christ's bad. You could say a different way to affirm life, a different way to affirm Christ, right? And so that way, and that's with policy debates. They affirm 99% of the same things, and then they have nuances of how to do it better, right? Yeah. So it doesn't have to focus this adversarial relationship, but they've got evidence that indicates that it's going to create this adversarial relationship, and it'll break down all those structures, which means that once you don't get access to any of your solving for the fear questions, I don't really have to resolve a lot else.
Yeah.
The other thing I'd say is that in the 2AC, you should have offense against their criticisms. Your strategy is basically no link, we solve permutation. You have one piece of offense in the queer criticism about how they would create static identities. You should make sure that you have a couple pieces of that, because in the 2AC you've essentially locked yourself down to only a single strategy, which destroys the 1AR's ability to have strategic flexibility. So you want to have something else that's and historical materialism bad, so that way you don't have to go for we solve the K, but you could go for your alternative is bad, right? And in the queer criticism, you sort of have that card, but it's not a heavy focus on the 1AR, but I have a bigger diversity to that, because that's how you create other ways, and that makes it much harder for them to be able to go for their criticisms, because then they have a diversity of things, versus I just have to explain why it links, and then I have answers to everything that was said. If you have other things, then it becomes much harder in that regards. I do think that the 2NR made the right decision going for the case in capitalism and not queer, because I think the 1AR had a larger focus on that position. And I think that when you were you look to the future because you affirm life. I think you needed to sort of explain how affirmation necessarily looks to the future versus just being an affirmation of life in the status quo. And what I was thinking, questions that you could do to set that up is ask, like, right, because they say affirm all life unconditionally, right? What happens between the question of the life of the fetus and the life of the mother, those sort of questions, right? If you ask that question, especially in the 1AC, where they don't know queerness is necessarily coming, but you can start with, like, what about the life of, like, a master and the life of the slave? And they'll be like, oh, well, you certainly have to affirm these lives, equally. And then you could get to that, and then they could be like, oh, well, you have to affirm those equally, or even consider the fetus at all. And at the point your criticism says that there's no reproduction for queers, right, that means that any valuing of the fetus as life is a future looking to it, right? And so you can ask that question sort of, in a series of questions where it doesn't really tip your hand to what you're doing, and then be able to point that out better. Or even without that question, you could make that argument, right? Because
I tried and I was like, when we were like, what is politics of life? Like, what does politics of life or affirming life mean? But we didn't get anywhere really, I think.
Yeah, I mean, and you could also, like, any sort of salvation stuff you could have gotten them talking about as a potential what happens, in the afterlife, which is still life. That seems to be like that could be future thinking. But you sort of need to explain where what they're doing is future thinking at the point that they're like, no, we keep looking at the status quo. And the other thing that I would say is that on the affirmative side, at some points you're like, we're not advocating all of Christianity and all of these things, and so we're just advocating affirmation of life. But at other points, you're pointing to historical examples that are like formats of Christianity. So it seems like you're picking and choosing a little bit, and an explanation at some point of how, like, and I think it's probably come out of your orthodoxy card, is like how the ones that you're saying are good are actually the modes of embodiment you're actually advocating, and the other ones are different, right?
Well, I think the articulation I normally make, and I made it, but no, certainly not well, I didn't think was like the modernity, right? Like, we endorse like pre-modern versions of Christianity because those were like the more inclusive, like they didn't go on crusades, stuff like that, like they were non-violent,
Right.
stuff like that.
Yeah, but then when they point to like historic things where it's like, and then Jesus didn't talk about slaves or these sort of things, and then you're like, oh, well, not that element, and then just this, one, like, and that seems to be then pre-modernity as well.
Okay.
And so it's not just all pre-modern forms of Christianity, but it's specific practices. And so, like, I think that would probably emerge out of your orthodoxy card where you could talk about how those specific practices are, and so that way you're not defending all. And so that way, when you say things like, we're not defending Christianity, and then you give Christian examples,
Yeah.
right, it's not necessarily entirely true. You are defending Christianity, but you're defending a very specific advocacy of Christianity, right? In the same way when someone's like a Republican or Democrat, they don't defend the entire platform, a very specific thing, right? And so you're a very specific advocacy within there, and I think if you could, flesh that out more, like, that could be potentially the overview of the case in a debate like this, is that this is the specific way and the specific sect that we're advocating. These other sects are different. And then when you get to those arguments, it becomes a lot easier, because I sort of, give a little bit of sympathy of, like, they're giving some specific answers, and you're just like, not that, but then this.
Okay.
And I think that will help.
In a world where they do ask like those, like mother versus fetus questions, slave versus slave master, what do you think like the best articulation is for that?
Well, I think you had good examples of how it's been confronted, places where there wasn't slavery and things like that. I think that maybe explaining it a little bit more, and like, I mean, I think the 2IR does better on that question in terms of giving examples, like people who were into slave trading and then found Christ and then was like, no, this is not right? And so it's like, there's a bunch of examples in which you could do that. But I mean, there are also parts of, like, Old Testament interpretation and Bible where it's like very explicit, like, this is how you ethically treat your slaves, and so you have to be like, we don't advocate Old Testament wholesale, which is what you do. It's the image of Christ, which is, essentially why a New Testament then emerged, and then how that New Testament reinterprets the Old, and even the New Testament is not static because, right, you're not the literal Christ, you're the fiction, the story of Christ, which means that story could be different than the books.
So normally we like just read a narrative and we're like, we don't defend the Bible, we just defend like what our narrative brings out. We're just like, it's like an act of mythos, stuff like that, and we just like really are just like, it's like we're not the Bible, we're just the narrative. Do you think that'd be a better strategy?
I think that when they're pushing on questions of like, what do you do to solve it, I think that it makes it, when I make my vote, being like, voting affirmative is voting for this narrative, opposed to now I have to think, is this a political strategy that I'm adopting it? Is it something that needs to solve, right? Once you read that narrative, you could believe the act of that solvency, or that act that we say have to take place, took place when we read that narrative, right? So then it's easier to then form your roll of the ballot not necessarily as being about what my ballot does as a judge, but as, you know, what it did in terms of you reading that. So then that sort of gets you around some of that solvency questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I think.
Well, good debate, y'all.
Yeah, like,
Thank you.
Good luck, y'all. Thank you so much for chiming in and comments.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, it was a good debate. I definitely enjoyed it.